Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Today's video is going to be a tutorial where I make and show you how to make these adorable heart hats. And I say heart hats because they are made to look like two hearts joined together at the ends. I was feeling a bit inspired by Valentine's Day and my love of 1950s headband hats and decided to combine the two. I made two of these hats in a couple of hours and had a lot of fun doing it, and I'm excited to share that process with all of you. So let's get started. For this project you will need a pattern, which I will have linked down below. It's hosted on my Patreon but is completely free and should easily print out onto two 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper. What you see in this video is a hand-drawn version. The version available for download will hopefully look a bit prettier, but lead to the same end result. To cover the hat, you'll need felt in your preferred color. You can buy polyester felt at most craft stores in 9 by 11 sheets, 2 of which will be more than enough for a hat. And if you're using felt sold by the yard, then a 1/4 yard should be plenty. I'll link where I purchased mine down below. The base of the hat will be interfacing, really strong interfacing, like the type used for handbags. I would personally recommend 71F Peltex by Pellon, which I will be using in this video, but the lighter weight Peltex 70W by Pellon will also work, and this will be linked down below as well. For shaping the hat, I recommend 18 gauge wire. You can use millinery wire if you're feeling fancy, or picture hanging wire from any hardware store. The gauge is a lot more important than the intended use, and you'll need about 48 inches per hat. I'll also be using tin snips to cut the wire and binder clips to temporarily secure it while sewing. You'll need cutting implements for the paper pattern, interfacing, and felt. And if you have them or are feeling a bit fancy, I'd recommend pinking shears for cutting the felt and adding a decorative edge to the hat. Mine were like $6 from Amazon. It will be linked in the description box as well. You'll need marking implements for the felt and interfacing, an embroidery floss that matches, coordinates, or even contrasts with your felt colors. It's basically up to you, along with some needles with large enough eyes to fit the unseparated strands of floss. Lastly, I'll be using pins and some ribbon, and a sewing machine, which isn't pictured. You could definitely make this without a sewing machine, it would just take a little longer. Step 1 is printing off the pattern, then cutting it out. The pattern consists of 2 sheets. One will be used to cut the hat base from interfacing, and the other to cut the felt that will cover the hat base. The pattern is identical, except one has 1/4 inch seam allowances. Once the pattern is cut out, pin the pieces marked interfacing front and interfacing back onto the interfacing. Once pinned, trace around both pattern pieces, following the edges as closely as you can, and I find ballpoint pen works best for marking the interfacing. Speaking of marking the interfacing, make sure to put a dot at the center point of both the front and back pieces. This should be marked on the pattern and easy to transfer to the interfacing. Remove the pattern and cut the pieces out. Now take those pieces over to your sewing machine, which should be set to a zigzag stitch with the largest stitch width it can accommodate and a length of about 2. Align the straightish edges of the interfacing and the center points of the pieces. Then starting from the center point, zigzag the pieces together with the edges flush. Do not overlap the edges, you just want them pressed against each other. Even though I referred to this as the straightish edge, it is in fact curved. It needs to be in order to form to the shape of a head, so some easing is required during this process. Once you reach the end of the pieces, backstitch, then move back to the center point and sew from that point to the remaining end. Now the base is done, well, sort of. It still needs some reinforcement, in the form of wire, so I'm cutting 2 lengths of wire that are approximately 24 inches long. The wire should begin about 3 inches away from the point of the heart, following the trajectory of the curved edge. You can use a pin to secure this end. Then begin bending the wire so it conforms to the shape of the interfacing, and use binder clips to secure it to the interfacing as you go. Now instead of following the entire perimeter of the hat with the wire, I'm bending the wire in almost an S shape, and only securing it to 2 opposite ends/sides of the hat. I'm not entirely sure how to explain this clearly, but that is why I make videos and not photoless documents. Hopefully the footage can make up for my voiceover failures. And like on the other side, the wire should extend a few inches past the point of the heart, and any excess can be cut away. Now it's time to return to the sewing machine, and using the same settings, I'll be zigzag stitching over the wire to secure it to the interfacing. Try to keep the wire centered in the presser foot, sew slowly, and pivot often. Basically do all you can to avoid hitting the wire with the needle, because that would be bad. And if you don't have a sewing machine, the wire can be whip stitched to the interfacing. I did that for all my hats for a number of years, it's just much slower. Though there is much less risk of breaking a needle, so that's nice. Now I'm repeating the bending and binder clipping process on the remaining edges of the hat. The wire will overlap the points of each heart and the center point of the hat, but that's okay. When the rest of the wire is in place, it's time to visit the sewing machine once more. This is sewn on using the exact same overly cautious method with one key difference. When you reach the points where the wire overlaps, take your foot off the sewing machine pedal. Then use the hand wheel to very slowly stitch forward over these points. If the needle threatens to hit the wire, lift the presser foot and adjust the project slightly until you have enough clearance. Once you are several stitches past the point where the wire overlaps, you can resume sewing normally. You just want to be very careful at the overlap points since the wire is going in two different directions, which means you're at least twice as likely to hit it. Now the base is done and the hard part is over. It's all smooth sailing or smooth sewing from here on out. Now you can pin the pattern pieces marked felt front and felt back to 2 sheets of felt. Then trace around the edges of the pattern pieces using any sort of marking implement that will show up on your felt, which for me, in this case, was chalk. When everything is traced, remove the pattern pieces, because the paper can distort the shape of the felt when cutting. However, you will want to pin the layers of felt together prior to cutting, since this ensures that there isn't any fabric slippage and that both layers are identical. Now if you want the hat to have a fancier edge, go ahead and repeat the pinning and marking and pinning again process. The straightish edges can still be cut with normal scissors, but the other outer edges should all be cut with pinking shears. And take your time here, making sure there aren't any awkward bits where the diagonal blade has overlapped. Now, regardless of what type of scissors you used, the remaining steps are the same. You want to pin the 2 felt front pieces to the 2 felt back pieces, with the right sides facing each other. And make sure the ends and the center points of these pieces line up nicely. Then they can be sewn together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I've gone back to sewing with a straight stitch. No zigzagging is needed in this step. You can use your fingers to aggressively crease this seam flat, but I would recommend ironing it instead. I'm ironing the seam allowance open, then pressing from the right side of the fabric to make sure it's nice and smooth. Now place whichever layer of the felt looks nicest with the right side facing down. Then place the interfacing hat base on top of it. The felt should extend about a 1/4 inch beyond the edges of the interfacing all the way around. Make sure the allowance is even around the edges of the hat base. Then begin pinning the felt to the interfacing. And make sure all these pins are on the right side, which is also the felt side of the hat. When the outer layer of felt is pinned in place, the remaining piece of felt can be pinned to the interior of the hat with the right side facing outward. If everything is pinned properly, there shouldn't be any interfacing visible on either side of the hat. If you pin to the edges, there will be slightly less allowance around the interfacing, since the decorative edge quite literally cuts into it, but it should still be possible to fully cover the interfacing with a bit of felt extending beyond each edge. The edges of the hat don't actually need to be finished. Felt, whether it's made from polyester or wool, should not fray. However, the edges do need to be secured together so they permanently encase the interfacing base. And to do this, I'm using 6 strands of embroidery floss, also known as the thickness of unseparated floss, and a handy stitch called the blanket stitch. I filmed this step at a few different angles to hopefully have some decent instructional footage of this process, but basically you bring the needle down through the right side of the fabric, a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the material. Then you move over a 1/4 inch and bring the needle back down through the right side of the fabric. Before pulling the stitch taut, bring the needle through the loop you've created. Pull tightly, then move over another 1/4 inch and repeat the process. Just remember that you always want to be bringing the needle through the front or the top side of the fabric. As long as you're doing that and remembering to go through the loop, it's pretty hard to go wrong. However, I personally find stitches really hard to learn through videos, so I'll link some helpful diagrams in the description box as well. And that way I can speed up the hour of footage I have relating to this process without feeling too guilty about it. However, before I do that, I did want to mention, if you paint the edges, take advantage of the even cuts provided and use those as a guide for the width of your stitches. And if you're worried about these stitches being uneven or you're new to this stitch in this process, then I'd recommend using floss that matches the felt pretty closely, because then it will barely be visible on the finished hat. Another note for anyone who uses pinking shears, since the edge is uneven, the blanket stitch might sit on top of it instead of alongside it. To fix this, just use your needle to maneuver the horizontal part of the stitch to sit on the underside of the felt. I repeated this process on my black hat as well, but the thread blends in a little too well and you can't see anything I'm doing, so I'm not going to include any more footage of that. Here's what the finished edges of the hat should look like if you didn't use pinking shears. And here's the finished pinked edge from the exterior and interior. Now it's time for more stitching, which is totally optional. I'm using contrasting thread for this and using large running stitches to sew a 1/4 inch away from the edges of the hat. And I'm not trying too hard to get these stitches even, since I'm not too bothered about the length of these stitches. I kind of like the crafty random look it has to it. And the whole reason I'm doing this is just to emphasize the heart shape, since it can get a little obscured by the seam allowance I added to the felt. When the decorative stitching was done, I felt like the hat was missing something, so I decided to sew on a little bow made from 3/8 of an inch wide ribbon to the center point of the hat. And to keep the tails of the ribbon from fraying, I used a lighter to melt the ends. This should work on most polyester ribbons. And I repeated this process on the black hat, except it got a larger striped bow, which is tacked on at a few points so it wouldn't flop around. And these are my finished hats. The black one was made specifically to pair with the black and white dress I also made with Valentine's Day in mind. A video about that will be out very soon. But the red one was just for fun, and fun it was. I really enjoyed this little project and the hats that I got out of it. Unfortunately, my hair did not want to behave the day I attempted to photograph these hats, so I apologize for all the flyaways. But these hats are really versatile in the way they can be positioned. Whether you want them cupping the back of your head, centered and perched atop the head, or cocked to one side, the options are endless. To keep the hat in place all day, form the wire in the hat to sit nicely over your scalp. Then slip a bobby pin or two between the layers of felt while catching a few strands of your hair. And I think that is all I have to say, which is a shame because I filmed like 10 minutes of modeling footage. But if you have any questions or there's something I didn't cover in this tutorial, then please feel free to ask in the comment section down below. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it, and if you'd like to see more, then you should subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I will talk to all of you very soon.